It was a rainy evening in Santa Fe when George R.R. Martin sat by the window of his writing room, staring at the thunderstorm like it was an old friend. His fingers hovered above the keyboard of his old computer, but the screen remained blank. He had written about kings, queens, traitors, heroes, dragons, and wolves. Yet every time someone asked him, "Who's your favorite character?" the answer was always the same: Daemon Targaryen. People often looked surprised when he said that. Not Jon Snow, not Tyrion Lannister, not Arya or even the mighty Daenerys, but Daemon, the rogue prince, the unpredictable brother, the dragon rider with a sword and a secret smile. But why? Even George himself wasn't sure when that love had started. Maybe it wasn't about love. Maybe it was something deeper, something darker. Back in the early urchins, George had been diving into the deep lore of Westeros. Not the stories fans already knew, but the forgotten parts, the dusty pages, the side notes, the ancient histories. That's when Daemon's name kept popping up, first in whispers, then in bold ink. A prince born into fire and shadow, loved by few, feared by many. And yet, he was the man who laughed in the face of rules, the man who rode Caraxes, the bloodworm, like a demon in the sky. He was called many things: kingmaker, traitor, lover, brother, murderer, hero, but none of them truly captured him. As George sat there, thunder cracking above his house, he smiled faintly and remembered something from his childhood. He had always hated perfect heroes. When he was a boy growing up in New Jersey, George devoured comic books. Superman, Batman, Captain America. But soon he got bored. The good guys were too good, the bad guys too bad. Life wasn't like that. His neighborhood wasn't like that. His family wasn't like that. People were messy, flawed, confusing. They could love you and hurt you in the same breath. That's why he created Westeros the way he did, full of broken people trying to survive in a brutal world. And that's why Daemon Targaryen stood out. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a villain. He was a villain. He was real. Daemon married his niece, fought his brother, made peace, then went to war again. He could switch from charm to cruelty in seconds. He fought bravely, but also plotted in the shadows. He didn't care about laws. He cared about legacy, blood, family, sometimes even love. And unlike many others, he didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. George loved that. One night, while working on Fire and Blood, George had poured himself a glass of wine and typed out Daemon's return from exile. It was supposed to be a simple scene, a quick moment. But he wrote for hours. He made the candles burn low. His wife knocked on the door twice to remind him it was late, but he kept going. Because Daemon had taken over. He wasn't just another Targaryen prince. He was the Harpet of Fire and Blood, the embodiment of what made the Targaryens so feared. And so fascinating, he didn't sit on the Iron Throne. But his actions changed its history. He didn't write songs, but people sang of him anyway. He didn't seek peace, but his wars shaped empires. And maybe deep down, George saw himself in Daemon. The outsider, the misunderstood one, the storyteller no one could quite control. As the storm raged on outside, George opened his notes and reread an old line he had once written about Daemon. He was made of flame and shadow, of laughter and lies, and no man could ever say where the truth ended and the legend began. George chuckled softly. That was it. That was the reason. Daemon Targaryen wasn't just his favorite character. Daemon was the most dangerous idea he had ever created. The next morning, George sat at his desk again. The storm had passed, but something was still thundering inside him. He couldn't get Daemon out of his mind. It wasn't just about the stories. It wasn't just about the war. There was something personal there. He pulled out an old notebook, one of the ones with dog-eared pages and coffee stains. This one was filled with early character sketches and notes from when he first began crafting Fire and Blood. The first time he wrote Daemon's name, he'd circled it twice. There were words scribbled beside it. Unpredictable, ruthless, romantic, loyal, dangerous. Free George read those words again and felt a strange connection. Daemon wasn't created in a day. He wasn't just a man with a sword and a dragon. He was the chaos that every story needed, but most writers were too scared to write. He thought about other characters he had made. Men like Ned Stark, who lived by honor and died by it. Jon Snow, the quiet protector. Tyrion, the clever outcast. They were great. They had fans all over the world. But they played by the rules, at least the moral rules. Desmond didn't. He was the man who could love you deeply and still betray you if it meant survival. He married his niece Rhaenyra, not out of pure politics or duty, but because he wanted her. She was the fire, and he was the match. They didn't wait for anyone's permission. George remembered how readers reacted to Daemon's marriage to Rhaenyra. Some called it disgusting, others romantic. Some said he manipulated her, others believed he saved her. That confusion, that division, that was exactly what George had wanted, because Daemon wasn't made to be liked. He was made to be remembered. He stood on the edge of every definition. A hero? Maybe a villain? Sometimes. A lover? Absolutely a killer. Without hesitation, George leaned back in his chair, thinking about the world. The real world. The one outside Westeros. The one where people pretended to be kind, where politics hid behind smiles, and where betrayal came in the form of silence. He had seen it all. Hollywood producers lying through their teeth, studios changing his stories for money, fans judging every word he wrote. Daemon, on the other hand, never hid who he was. That honesty, even in its most brutal form, was something George respected, admired, maybe even envied. He remembered writing one particular scene, Daemon's duel with Sir Daemon Targaryen. Daemon had accused Rhaenyra's children of being bastards. He had insulted her in front of the court. While the others gasped and waited for legal justice, Daemon walked forward and cut the man's head in half. No warning, no speeches, just action. It was shocking, it was violent, but it was also satisfying. Because Daemon didn't believe in wasting time on fake politeness. George had always said, words are wind. But Daemon took that to the next level. He didn't bother with too many of them. His actions were louder, clearer, deadlier, and despite all that, he wasn't heartless. That's what made him complex. After all, he had loved his first wife, Rhaenyra Velaryon. When she died, he had mourned. Quietly, like a man who had seen too much death to scream about it anymore, he had daughters he protected. A family he fought for, a legacy he built with blood and fire. There was something real in that. Something more than what fans could see on the page. It was hidden between the lines, something only a writer could understand. Daemon was the kind of character George could write about endlessly and still discover something new. One day, during an interview, someone had asked George, if you could have dinner with any one of your characters, who would it be? He smiled and said, Daemon Targaryen. The interviewer laughed. Isn't he a bit dangerous? George had shrugged.
Yes.
But at least he wouldn't lie to me. That stuck with him. Now, as he stared out at the calm skies, George realized something. Maybe the reason he loved Daemon wasn't just about the character's story. Maybe it was because Daemon reminded him of himself, the parts of himself he couldn't always show. The fighter, the stubborn man who wouldn't bend to others, the one who chose truth even when it burned everything around him. That was Daemon. That was why he mattered. That was why he would always be the favorite. George tapped his fingers on the table, slowly, like a drummer thinking of a beat no one else could hear. The world outside had moved on. Cars passed, birds chirped, people smiled at nothing. But George was still inside that other world, the world of blood, fire, and unspoken truths. Daemon Targaryen wasn't just a prince. He was a reminder, a mirror, a shadow most people didn't want to admit they had inside them. When George first started writing him, he thought Daemon would be a side character, maybe a wild card in the royal court. But every time he sat down to write, Daemon forced his way to the front. Like he refused to be background noise, he wanted the spotlight and he took it without asking. There was one scene George remembered writing that changed everything. It was when Daemon returned to King's Landing after years away. The people hated him. The nobles whispered about him. The king, his own brother, didn't trust him. And yet Daemon walked into the Red Keep like he owned it. Not because he had a claim, not because he wanted the crown, but because he could. That's what George found so irresistible. Daemon never asked for permission. He never begged to be accepted. He didn't care if the world liked him. He just was, and the world could either follow him or fall. George had lived a different life, a quieter one. As a young writer, he'd been ignored by publishers, rejected more times than he could count. Told that his stories were too dark, too complicated, too slow, he was asked to simplify, to shorten, to write what people wanted to read, but he refused. He kept writing his way, just like Daemon lived his way, and that defiance, that refusal to bend, it made people uncomfortable. That's what he saw in Daemon too. People couldn't decide what box to put him in. Was he a villain, a protector, a traitor, a brother, a king? He was all of it, and none of it. He changed depending on who you asked. George loved that, because life was like that. He remembered how Daemon killed his first wife, Rhea Royce. The show skipped it. People online called it cold, cruel, heartless. But George never wrote it as simple evil. Their marriage had been a cage. Two people forced together who despised each other. And Daemon? He broke out of that cage, in the ugliest way possible, yes. But he broke free, was it right? Probably not. But it was real, and real was what mattered to George. And people forget that Daemon didn't kill for fun. He killed for power, for survival, for love. Sometimes. He didn't waste his blade on the weak. He chose his enemies carefully. He made bold moves, yes, but never foolish ones. He played a dangerous game, and he played it better than most. Even when he died, because yes, Daemon Targaryen did die, he did it on his own terms, in fire, in blood, in battle, not in bed, not in peace, not forgotten. That was the kind of death George admired. Not because it was glorious, but because it was earned. There's a scene in George's head that he never even put to paper. A scene that lives only in his imagination. Daemon, in his older years, standing at the edge of a battlefield. Armor cracked, sword bloody, eyes tired but sharp. Smoke behind him, coursers around him, his dragon above him screaming into the sky. And he's smiling. Not because he's won, but because he's still standing. That was Daemon. The man who survived what should have killed him, the man who made legends just by walking into a room. George often wondered if that's what scared people about Daemon the most, not his crimes, not his choices, but the fact that he didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was. He didn't wear masks. He didn't apologize. He didn't hide. In a world full of liars, Daemon told the truth with his actions. And that truth, it made him unforgettable. Even now, as George sat back in his chair, his heart heavy and full at the same time, he whispered to himself, Daemon was never meant to be liked. He was meant to be understood. George lit a cigar that night. He didn't usually smoke indoors, but some nights weren't made for rules. He leaned back in his old chair, puffing slow, eyes staring at nothing. He could hear the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, but his mind wasn't in Santa Fe anymore. It was flying over Westeros, on dragonback with a sword strapped to his hip with Daemon. Daemon wasn't the kind of man who asked for your loyalty. He took it. He didn't smile to charm you. He smiled because he knew something you didn't. There was a cocky sharpness in his smirk, like a man who had already figured out how this game ends and wasn't afraid to lose a few pieces getting there. George remembered writing the scene where Daemon crowned Rhaenyra during the Dance of the Dragons. The realm was broken, the kingdom in chaos, his enemies sharpening their knives. And what did Daemon do? He knelt. In front of his wife, his queen, his niece, his choice. It wasn't about honor. It wasn't even about love, really. It was about belonging. For all his sins, Daemon had one clear truth. He was never truly loyal to the crown. He was loyal to the people he chose. And when he chose Rhaenyra, he chose her with blood, with war, with fire. Most men in Westeros said they served something bigger, God's duty peace. Daemon didn't play that lie. He served himself first, then his blood, then maybe his kingdom. If it didn't work in that order, he'd burn the map and redraw it. George respected that more than he liked to admit, because he'd done the same in his life. He had told Hollywood no, again and again, when they tried to cut his stories into safe little packages. He'd walked away from money, from fame, from the kind of power most writers dreamed of, just because someone told him, change it to make it easier. Daemon wouldn't have changed it. He would have walked out, mounted Caraxes, and flown straight over the damn studio. And sometimes George wished he could have done that too. He leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the desk. The smoke curled around him like ghosts. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo. It was old black and white from a book signing in the Chojas. He looked younger, beard less gray, eyes still hungry. In the photo, he was holding a copy of a Game of Thrones like it was a weapon. He remembered how no one had believed in it, how fantasy was dead, how they said nobody wants swords and dragons anymore, and yet he had written it anyway. He had written about a world that punished honor, that rewarded cruelty, that tore good men apart because that's what life looked like to him. Not fairy tales, not happy endings, and in that world, Daemon Targaryen wasn't a mistake. He was the natural result. People liked to judge characters like him. They'd call him toxic, evil, broken. But George would always think, have you looked around your own world lately? The men who smile at cameras while lying to millions? The ones who wage wars in suits and ties? The ones who hurt people quietly, politely, with laws and loopholes? Daemon didn't pretend. He didn't sit in silence while his enemies plotted. He didn't give speeches about justice while poisoning the well. He killed who needed to be killed. He protected who he cared about. He didn't justify his actions. He just made sure they were remembered. There was something honest in that. Brutal, yes, but honest. Old George put the photo back and stood up, stretching his back. His bones cracked. He wasn't young anymore. But the fire inside him, that same fire Daemon carried, it hadn't gone out. He walked over to the window. Outside, the stars were sharp and clear, a quiet night. But inside him, Daemon was roaring again, waiting, demanding to be written, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a man who refused to be shaped by anyone else's hand. "You're," George whispered, almost like a prayer. "You." History never knew what to do with men like you. There was something deeply wrong with the way people wanted. They're heroes these days. At least that's what George believed. Everyone wanted the safe kind, the noble fool, the always right warrior, the sad-eyed rebel who never crossed the line. But George had never trusted clean heroes. Heroes like that? They were lies in armor. A Daemon Targaryen didn't wear that kind of armor. His was scratched, bloodied, dented, real. His hands weren't clean, and his heart wasn't pure. But George would still argue every time that Daemon was more honest than half the good men in Westeros. He remembered writing a conversation between Daemon and a maester, one that didn't make it into the final book. The maester accused him of treason, of breaking oaths, of dishonoring his blood. Daemon just laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not even mocking, just tired. And he said, "If honor ever fed a hungry child or saved a dying wife, I'd wear it like a cloak. But it doesn't. It's a lie we sell to men before we bury them." George had never forgotten that lie, because that was the core of Daemon's world, a place where survival didn't care about morality, a place where power meant living another day and softness meant your head on a spike. Westeros didn't reward the good, it ate them alive. So who lived? Men like Daemon. He did what others couldn't. He said what others wouldn't. He killed when no one else had the stomach for it, and he lived with it. There was nothing poetic about Daemon's choices. No music played when he killed. No tears fell when he walked away from a burning castle. He wasn't haunted the way some men were, not because he had no soul, but because he'd buried it a long time ago. Maybe the world took it from him. Maybe he gave it away on purpose. George never decided. But that emptiness inside Daemon, that silence where guilt was supposed to be, it was flaw. It was a weapon. George had known men like that in real life, in war, in backroom meetings, in Hollywood boardrooms. Men who smiled with their teeth but not their eyes. Men who could destroy you with a handshake. But Daemon didn't hide his nature. He didn't pretend. That's what separated him from the real monsters. People called Daemon heartless, but they forgot who he held close. He loved Rhaenyra, not just for her beauty, but because she was fire like him. He stayed beside her when the world turned against her, when her father failed her, when the court whispered and the kingdom crumbled. He didn't run. He stood beside her throne, sword in hand, daring anyone to come take what was hers. George had written that scene with shaking fingers, Daemon standing behind Rhaenyra as the lords gathered. Eyes daring, half smile ready, sword resting by his side like it already knew who to kill next. No speeches. No grand loyalty vows, just his presence. That was Daemon's way. No noise, just presence. George always said the scariest man in a room isn't the one shouting. It's the one watching, waiting, knowing when to strike. That was Daemon. And even when his choices were reckless, when he took Harrenhal without permission, when he rode into battle without orders, when he killed without blinking, George still felt that familiar pull in his chest. Not because he admired Daemon's violence, but because Daemon refused to live on his knees. He would rather burn than beg. That truth hit George harder than any sword ever could. Because in his own life, George had felt that same fire. When publishers rejected him, when fans demanded he finish their favorite character's arc, when producers offered millions to rewrite what he knew was right, he had smiled, politely. But deep down he'd been Daemon, burning bridges, breaking rules, walking away from fake loyalty. That's why in the quiet corners of his notebooks, George never called Daemon a villain. He called him a reminder of what it cost to stay true to yourself, of the price of freedom, and most of all, of the danger that came with being the only one in the room who didn't need anyone's permission to exist. It was close to midnight when George found himself staring at a half-finished manuscript, an old draft of Fire and Blood, pages covered in red ink, corrections, cuts, rewrites. But one thing hadn't changed. Daemon's pages were untouched. Not a single edit, not a single hesitation. George ran his hand across those paragraphs like he was touching something alive. Because Daemon didn't read like fiction, he felt real, breathing, bleeding, watching. Somewhere deep in the bones of the story, Daemon wasn't just a character, he as a presence. Some writers created characters to serve a plot. Daemon was the plot. People always ask George the same thing. What makes a character great? And he always gave them the polite answers. Depth, flaws, conflict, growth. But the truth? A great character is the one who refuses to obey the writer. That was Daemon. He didn't care about arcs or pacing or structure. He didn't exist to please readers or fit a message. He did what he wanted, on the page and inside George's head. When George wrote him, he didn't feel like the god of the story. He felt like a servant. Like he was just there to watch Daemon burn the world, and he liked that. Because there's something addictive about watching a man who has nothing to lose and no one to fear. Daemon didn't walk around trying to be feared. He wasn't a try-hard. It was just in him, the way he looked, the way he moved, the silence between his words. You didn't know if he was going to kiss you or cut your throat, and sometimes he did both. George had always believed that the most terrifying people were the ones who didn't brag about it. Young Daemon never bragged. He just acted, and every action was a message. When he took Caraxes and flew to Dragonstone to steal back a dragon egg. Alone, with no army, no backup, that wasn't just arrogance. That was a statement. He was telling the world, I don't need your approval. I don't need your crown. I'm still the most dangerous man in this kingdom. And the truth, Daemon wasn't some mindless killer. That's what people got wrong. He wasn't out for chaos. He was out for control. He played the game better than the schemers and smiled while doing it. And when people thought they had him figured out, he flipped the board. George remembered the letters he used to get, fans arguing over Daemon like he was a real person. He's evil. He's misunderstood. He's a narcissist. He's a hero in disguise. George never corrected them, because that's what made Daemon powerful. You could never pin him down. He wasn't there to fit your idea of good or bad. He is a fire no one could hold in their hands. And somewhere, deep inside, George understood that rage, that restlessness, that part of a man that didn't want to be tamed. All his life, people tried to box George in, write faster, make the characters nicer, add more romance, more romance. Kill fewer people, give us a happy ending. He smiled, nodded, and then went back to his desk and wrote about a prince who to kill his way through a kingdom just to crown the woman he loved. Because Daemon didn't ask for happy endings. He created moments so powerful, even his enemy had to respect them. There's a scene George never put in the book. It only lived in his private journal. A scene where Daemon, older now, sits alone at the top of Harrenhal, staring down at the ruins. His hair is silver, but his eyes are sharper than ever. A squire comes in and asks him if he regrets anything. Daemon doesn't even look up. He just says, I regret the times I held back. That line haunted George, because that wasn't fiction, that was truth. Everyone regrets the things they didn't do, the punches they didn't throw, the chances they let pass, the words they swallowed, but not Daemon. He lived with his sins. He owned every drop of blood on his hands. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made him unforgettable, not because he was perfect, but because he was free. There was a strange silence in George's house that night, the kind that didn't come from peace, but from something unfinished, something still crawling under the skin, hungry, unresolved. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the edge of his bed with his old notes spread around him. Pages from decades ago, ink smeared, corners torn, ideas that never made it into books, notes written at sane.m. While the world slept and Daemon was still awake inside his head, he picked up one of those pages. On it, in big capital letters, he'd written, "In a character should be safe." That was his law. Not a rule for writing, a rule for truth. People wanted comfort, stories where the hero wins, where love conquers, where bad guys lose. But George had never believed in that, because that's not how life worked. That's not how his life had worked. Daemon wasn't a safe character. He was a blade pointed at the reader's chest. He made you uncomfortable. He made you question yourself. Because if you hated him, why couldn't you stop reading about him? And if you loved him, what did that say about you? George liked that discomfort. He fed on it. Because stories weren't supposed to be clean. They were supposed to bleed. He remembered a moment in the Dance of the Dragons, the one no one liked to talk about. The one where Daemon sends two assassins, Blood and Cheese, to kill the son of Queen Helena as revenge for the death of Lucerys, Rhaenyra's boy. Not a soldier, not a warrior, just a child. Daemon didn't do it with his own hands, but he ordered it. Indirectly, quietly, and when the child's head was delivered in a sack, he didn't weep, he didn't flinch. He just said, an eye for an eye was too little. That scene made people furious. They called Daemon a monster, but George, he smiled when he wrote it, not because he liked the death, not because he celebrated the violence, but because it was honest. That's what vengeance looked like. Ugly, cruel, unfair. Daemon didn't believe in fair. He believed in pain for pain. And George understood that better than most. He had been betrayed in his career. People he trusted who took his ideas and twisted them. Studios who promised to protect his work but butchered it in silence. Colleagues who smiled to his face, then stabbed him in meetings he wasn't invited to. He never sent assassins, of course. But in his writing, he let the rage speak. He let men like Daemon burn the world he couldn't touch. That's why Daemon wasn't just a prince on a dragon. He was George's revenge fantasy, a man who never bowed, never begged, never played polite. He didn't care if you liked him. He only cared that when he died, the world would never forget his name. And it didn't. Even years later, long after the Dance of the Dragons ended, long after his body fell from Caraxes during that final brutal duel over the God's Eye, people still whispered Daemon's name like it meant something sacred. A man who died with his blade buried in his enemy's throat. Not a king, not a hero, but a legend. And maybe George thought of that's what mattered most. Not how long you ruled, not how many loved you, but how deeply you carved your name into the bones of history. Daemon had done that, not with kindness, not with mercy, but with will, and George loved him for it. Because deep down, George didn't want to be remembered for playing it safe. He wanted to be remembered for writing truth, and the truth was this, Some men aren't made for peace. Some men aren't born to kneel. Some men don't wait for permission to live the way they choose. They ride dragons, they take what they want. They die with blood in their mouths and fire in their eyes. And the world remembers them because it has no other choice. George didn't cry easily. Not for real things. Not for life. Not for death. But that night, alone in his writing room, he felt something heavy in his chest. Not sadness. Not even regret. It was loss. That strange kind of emptiness that comes when a part of you has already said goodbye. Daemon was long dead in the lore. The ink had dried. The pages had been printed. Fans had dissected every line, every action, every rumor about him. The world had moved on. But George hadn't. Because for him, Daemon wasn't just some character that lived and died in the Targaryen family tree. Daemon was a ghost that refused to leave the room. He still spoke to George in quiet moments. He still stood behind his shoulder, watching as he wrote other stories. And every time George created a new prince, or warrior, or rule breaker, he'd stop and think, but would Daemon have done it better? The answer was always yes, because Daemon didn't second-guess himself. He didn't ask if he was right. He just acted and let history catch up later. George admired that in a way most people wouldn't understand. Not unless they'd been torn apart by indecision. Not unless they'd lived with people-pleasing scars. Not unless they knew what it felt like to be swallowed by silence while the world demanded fake smiles and careful words. A Daemon didn't play that game, and that freedom, that dangerous, selfish freedom, it was the most seductive thing George had ever written. Not the dragons, not the power, not even the blood. It was freedom. Daemon didn't owe anyone anything. Not the crown, not the people, not the gods. He chose who he protected. He chose who he destroyed. And even when his choices dragged the kingdom into hell, he stood by them. He didn't apologize. He didn't hide. He stood in the fire and owned it. How many people could do that? How many writers, how many kings, how many men? George had lived his life surrounded by masks. Editors pretending to care about the story. Producers pretending to care about the vision. Fans pretending to love the characters while demanding their heads. Daemon didn't wear a mask. He was the fire beneath the mask everyone else wore. And when George looked back on his life, through every contract, every betrayal, every fight for control over his own story, he saw one truth rise above all the noise. Daemon Targaryen was the man he wished he could be. Not in cruelty, not in murder, but in clarity. Daemon never got lost in doubt, never choked on fear, never begged for acceptance. He didn't care if you loved him, he didn't care if you feared him. He only cared that when he died, the world would still remember the weight of his name, and they did. Daemon died the only way he ever could, in a final act of pure, brutal defiance. The skies above the gods' eye burned red. Caraxes and Vhagar tore each other apart in a storm of flame and wings and screaming. And Daemon, broken older, exhausted, still climbed onto his dragon with nothing but rage in his heart and his sword in his hand. He didn't fly out to survive. He flew out to end it, to carve his final message into the sky with fire. He met Aemon face to face, brother against brother, Targaryen against Targaryen. And just before they crashed into the lake below, George imagined Daemon smiling, because he knew. This wasn't about winning. This was about writing the kind of ending no man could erase. Not even time. Not even kings. Not even the maesters who tried to twist the story later. And when Caraxes' broken body washed ashore days later, Daemon's was gone. Never found. No grave. No crown. Just silence. That's how legends end, not with applause, but with mystery, with fear, with fire that never fully dies. George set down his pen. There were other characters, other stories, other endings to write, but none of them would ever feel like Daemon. Because Daemon Targaryen wasn't just a name in a book. He was the proof that some men, no matter how hated, burned too bright to be forgotten. And that fire is why George R. R. Martin will always love him the most.